All right. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event about Dr. Carl Elliott's new book, The Occasional Human Sacrifice, Medical Experimentation, and the Price of Saying No. My name is Shayna, and I am the Access and Events Coordinator. Before we get started, I'd like to provide some access reminders for our hybrid event, which I've also pasted into the chat for our virtual folks. If you'd like more customized, reliable captions, they are available at tinyurl.com/Longmore captions. For this webinar, we have turned off the chat, so if you have questions, please use the Q&A box or email us at pklinst@sfsu.edu. And again, all of these reminders are in the chat. I'd also like to provide a disclaimer before we begin. The topic today explores some violent and troubling stories of institutional harm and self-harm. So please take care of yourself if the content is weighing heavy on you. And lastly, there will be a Q&A towards the end of the event. So if you are in the virtual space, feel free to send in your questions at any time. And we'll also be doing a book giveaway. So with that being said, over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Shayna. Hi, everybody. Hi to everyone in the room. Hi to everybody who's with us virtually. I see we have 70 people on, which is great. My name is Emily Badix. I am the interim director at the Longmore Institute on Disability here at SF State. And I am very excited to be bringing you this program today with the Health Equity Institute and the SDS Hub, both here at the university, and also with the Center for Genetics and Society. So this is a really collaborative program. It is a pleasure to get to introduce you to our speakers. I first met Carl after reading his book, Better Than Well, which explored the way that enhancement technologies allow us to define ourselves in new ways, in better than well ways. And I was really fascinated with an interest in disability on what that meant, with a raising bar of normalcy. His next book, White Coat, Black Hat, cut deep into the dark side of American medicine. It explored corruption in big pharma and its pervasive flaws, including the medical ethicists who sometimes function a little less as watchdogs and more as lapdogs. That book also had big ramifications for disabled people, as we know, who pays the price when consumerism enters medicine. Today, he joins us to talk about his newest book, The Occasional Human Sacrifice, which explores whistleblowers in medical abuse scandals. Hosting Carl today gives us an opportunity to dive again into the disability connection, as well as the many different populations that we see being harmed by the medical abuses that he brings to light. And as I'm just excited to celebrate what is an incredible book, KQED Forum described it as both riveting and horrifying. And that's very, very accurate from my experience. I'm extremely grateful to our advisory council chair, Milton Reynolds, who's moderating and chatting with Carl today. Milton is an educator, an author, an equity and inclusion consultant, an activist, and an expert in eugenics, past and present. And so I'm excited to see some of the connections of eugenic history to the work that you're doing, Carl. So with that, I pass it over to you. And thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us. Yeah. Well, let me start, Carl, by saying, first of all, it's a pleasure to meet you in person, but I also want to congratulate you on a really wonderful book. I also found it deeply engaging, but also chilling, at the same time. And so I'd like to dive into that a little bit more today. Having done a little bit of writing, I know sometimes you start on a project, you've got a certain set of ideas about where it's going to go. And then through the process of engaging with it, it takes you to a different place. And so using that as a framework, what story did you believe you were going to tell, right, when you started your book? And what are you left wondering about now, looking back on that process?
That's a complicated question. Thanks for starting with such a difficult one.
I only know softball.
So this book basically started with my own experience trying to get an external investigation into a suicide in a psychiatric research study at the University of Minnesota, where I work and where I taught bioethics at that point for about 11 years. So this all sort of began for me in 2008. And after it became clear that the university was not going to give this research death a fair look, maybe I should say just a little bit about it. This was a young man with mental illness, floridly psychotic, schizophrenic, violent, talking to devils and angels, who was taken to the emergency room at our teaching hospital at the University of Minnesota, seen by the head of our schizophrenia program, put on a locked unit, involuntarily committed, and then the commitment order was used as a sort of tool of coercion to force him into an industry-funded clinical trial over the objections of his mother, who thought he was in danger of killing someone or perhaps himself, and who had tried fruitlessly for 4 months to get him out of the trial, begging, pleading, sending emails, leaving voicemails, writing letters, turning up at the Department of Psychiatry, eventually leaving a voice message saying, does he have to kill somebody or kill somebody else before anyone does anything? And 3 weeks after that, he was found dead in the shower of his halfway house after having tried to decapitate himself with a box cutter. It was a horrific story. It was written up in the St. Paul Pioneer Press in a 4-part series. I was alarmed by this when I read it, partly because I knew one of the reporters who was a friend of mine, and I knew he was a very conscientious, really excellent health reporter, partly because it took place at my own university, and partly because all of the forces there were things that I had worked on and even been involved in. I mean, I worked on psychiatric ethics. I had friends in the Department of Psychiatry. I'd been on the Institutional Review Board, the Ethics Committee that oversees research studies at the university. And yet, a young man had tried to decapitate himself in a research study 4 years ago, and I hadn't heard anything about it, all of which really alarmed me. I mean, I'd have to compress another 7 years, which I will do. I thought, after trying to get some action on this internally, I wound up writing about it along with some fraud by the sponsor of the study, AstraZeneca, for Mother Jones Magazine, thinking that I could shame the university into doing something about it by writing about it for a national magazine. That didn't work. So as to your first question, what did I think I was doing? I thought I was doing investigative reporting, basically. And I thought that was the end of the story. And it turned out it was only the beginning of the story, because it did nothing. It did nothing to move the university, did nothing to shame the university, basically did nothing except to make me a sort of despised figure at the university medical school myself. And then I spent the next 5 years trying and eventually succeeding in getting an external investigation with the help of some allies at the University of Minnesota and a former governor, Arne Carlson. And so there was a state investigation. It basically corroborated every accusation that we had made. But still, the university wasn't shamed. They did the things that institutions usually do. They say, we're going to put together a task force and we're going to have some committees and, the usual kind of hand waving and and things that you need to do to mollify legislatures and oversight bodies. And then, after maybe a year or so of that, it became clear that nothing really was going to change. That was a very demoralizing result, to actually get what we had been working for 8 years and then find out that it really made no difference at all. So then my question was, is the University of Minnesota a uniquely terrible institution? Or are other institutions just as bad? And that's what led me sort of into the book, to try to look at other cases where whistleblowers, insiders had spoken out about abuses in research studies, how institutions had responded, and if there were any other institutions that did things better than mine.
Yeah. And so we'll circle back around to that as we sort of close our exchange. But one of the things I was struck by is that, I operate in a world with the assumption that if you know better, you'll do better. And so it was interesting to read and to be continually troubled by all these learned folks in these powerful institutions. And you would think that when questions of ethics or morality are raised, that the Hippocratic Oath or something would kick in that would cause them to stand up and to leverage their knowledge in service of a greater humanity. But instead, what at least my interpretation was, that they were less and less likely to speak out the further they ascended in those institutions. And so I wonder, what do you think about that? And
Yeah.
And how do you navigate that? Because clearly you found a way to speak out, and it was consequential, but there was something that drove you to call it like it was when you encountered these troubling patterns. So I'd love you to address that if you could.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So here's the demoralizing part. It just gets worse and worse. The answer to the question, do other research institutions do any better, is no. None of them do. They all deny when abuses occur and they're made aware of them, they all deny wrongdoing. They all stonewall the press. They all vilify and punish the whistleblowers. They never apologize, and they do everything they can to avoid compensating or apologizing to the victims of the studies. If they do apologize or compensate, it's not voluntarily, it's because they're forced to by the outside, by the threat of a lawsuit or oversight bodies or something else. I have not come across a single case of research abuse in which a research institution voluntarily did the right thing. By which I mean those things and sort of try to reform itself. So there's sort of two pieces, I think, to your question. One is the question of, why do most people in research institutions say nothing? Because this is actually the pattern. When I decided to write about whistleblowers, I'd been teaching a class on research abuses for probably I'm probably starting my 10th year now, 9th or 10th year. And so we look at about maybe 26 research scandals a term. It's a very demoralizing class. 2 scandals a week, nonstop for a whole semester. And the idea of teaching the class was, if we look at these scandals side by side, maybe I can see patterns that emerge. And one of the patterns that emerged is that staying silent. Turns out that whistleblowers are actually quite rare. I had thought that whistleblowing would be the main way that research scandals are exposed. Turns out that's not the way. Usually the way they are exposed are, one, the scandal is so bad, a spectacular death that's unexpected, that can't be kept under cover. That's one way. Another way, and probably the most common way, is for victims or the families of victims to speak out and get in touch with an attorney or an oversight body or the press or someone else. It's actually very rare for insiders to speak out. And the cases where I could find that actually happens are the ones that I wrote about in the book. But they're really only 6. There are others, but the others that I was able to find were so far in the past that the whistleblowers have passed away. So one question is, why do so many people stay quiet for so long, and how do they live with themselves? And the other one is, what's different about the people who do stand up and speak out? Is it something about them? Is it something about their situation? Is it something about their proximity to the abuses? Like, what is it exactly? And so that was what I was trying to figure out in the book.
Yeah. So one point earlier in the book, you referred to the Holy Trinity of cases, and I think that was an interesting sort of framing. And I'd love for you just to speak to why those 3 stand out in particular, but also to recognize that many of those things are taking place. I guess they're all breaking in the early 70s.
Yeah.
And thinking about it through historical lens, that's nearly a quarter century after the conclusion of the Nuremberg trials. And so what does it mean that these things are happening 25 years after those trials and happening on American soil?
Right.
Like, how do we peer into that, and how do we understand that?
Well, the Holy Trinity, this is Susan Reverby's term. Susan Reverby, the historian who wrote about Tuskegee. The Holy Trinity, in her words, are the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Willowbrook hepatitis study, and the cancer studies at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in New York. And the reason she calls them the Holy Trinity is that these are the scandals that are held up, that are always taught to medical students in bioethics classes, and are held up as, the sort of epic scandals that led to the research reforms of the 1970s, the National Research Act in 1974, and then the ensuing events that led to our research oversight system now. So when she says the Holy Trinity, she intends it a little bit kind of ironically, because I think for a lot of us, it doesn't feel as if things were fixed after the scandals of the 60s and the 1970s. It's often presented to the research community and to doctors and to medical students and so on as if those were the bad days when terrible things were done to research subjects, but we're all beyond that now because we have this oversight system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it takes me to sort of a framing, and maybe if I can use this as a way of sort of creating a sort of a disability connection. When I read through the studies, I think I was struck by 2 things. And so looking at the people who were transgressed against, this notion that for the vast majority of those groups, they were seen as categorically disposable or unfit. Now that could have been either because of socioeconomic status, others them being disabled, being of color, or being, poor or otherwise sick.
Or all of
all of the above in many cases, right? So this notion of them being less, quote unquote, than fit also seemed to make them less worthy and therefore deserving of whatever happened to them. The flip side of that equation was also looking at the lionizing of the institution, that the institution can do no wrong. And in the name of science, we can countenance certain kinds of losses. And so it focuses lens both on the way the institution sees itself and its role in protecting society, if you will, from the harms, and using that as a normalization or a rationalization for the subjugation and subordination, and quite frankly, extraction from groups of people, and categorically so.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to sort of maybe tease that out a little bit, and that seemed to be a pattern across the case studies that you've interrogated. Was I wrong in that, or? does
You're
that sound-
absolutely right. And if you look beyond the cases that I wrote about in the book to, you know, the larger pattern like we look at in our class, that's absolutely the case. It is almost always the case that you're looking at a population, when you look at an abuse and a scandal, that is vulnerable in some way. I mean, very often it's, you know, vulnerable very obviously because they're mentally ill, they're mentally disabled, they are uneducated or undereducated, or they're poor, or they're racial minorities. But it can also be, for example, that they're dying. They have a, you know, they have a terminal illness. They're desperate for some sort of cure and are grasping at straws. There are a whole variety of things that can make a research subject less than perfectly able to give proper informed consent. Now, the way the research guidelines are written up, there's supposed to be special protections for vulnerable populations. But the special protections are vague and weak and don't really do a lot to actually protect vulnerable populations. So the whistleblower that I talked to is one of the, there are really two whistleblowers or two sort of activists involved in exposing the Willowbrook, the scandals that research abuses at the Willowbrook State School. One of them, the guy that I spent the most time with, is Mike Wilkins. And Mike says medical training indoctrinates you into a caste system. And patients are at the bottom, doctors are at the top. And by your second year of training, you have been thoroughly, you're gone, right? With rare exceptions, this becomes your worldview. And I think there's something actually to that. One of the things that struck me about all of the medical whistleblowers in the book, they're not all medical whistleblowers, but a lot of them are medically trained doctors, is they all have terrible things to say, bitter, angry things to say about medical school, medical training, academic medicine, the culture of academic medicine. Their complaints vary, but almost universally, it is the case that they're there. One of the things that I think, maybe I should explain, I went to medical school first before doing a PhD in philosophy. And, you know, the two experiences are completely different, right? One of the things that I think people on the outside of medicine don't realize, and I'm talking here about academic medicine, not medical practice as a whole, but academic medical institutions are extraordinarily hierarchical, rigid, authoritarian institutions, like the military, right? And so, there's a sense in which a lot of this is necessary. A medical student knows nothing, right? You don't want medical students improvising. It's an apprenticeship, and you learn how to do things as you go along. So there is a certain measure of hierarchy that has to be there. But it doesn't have to be as extreme and sort of totalizing as it actually is. This makes dissent, moral dissent in academic medical institutions very difficult. I think harder than it is in a lot of other organizations. Because you're sort of indoctrinated in this way of seeing the world. It is an elite institution. You're constantly told you're special. This is what you need to do to become part of the club. Not everybody can do it. Everybody wants to, but you're one of the special few who actually can. And this is what you need to do to become accepted by the rest of us. So that's a piece of it. Academic medicine also, not every academic medical institution, but most, the sort of elite institutions, where the vast majority of academic medical research is done. Medical research is the coin of the realm. This is how you get status. This is how you advance. You do good research, you get grant money, especially grant money from the elite sources, NIH being the best, but federal funding. But there is this drive to produce research, and your value in the institution depends on contributing to that. And it is a righteous mission. It is seen as a righteous mission. It is, morally a good thing. And academic medical institutions see this as what separates them from the rest of medicine, which is about patient care, right? But academic medicine is about medical research, and it's a humanitarian mission, and it has a kind of utilitarian ethos that has to be balanced out against the interests of patients. And this is, forever, this has been the tension in research ethics. How do you balance the interests of patients who are generally volunteering for clinical trials because they want some sort of novel treatment, and the larger interests of science, which are all about producing scientific advances. And it's very easy for the interests of patients to be overlooked or minimized in that larger mission.
Yeah, thanks for sort of illuminating sort of the inner workings of the systems. I mean, sort of the elite nature of it, the specialness of it strikes me as also in some ways uniquely eugenic, and but also probably really affirming. To be a member of the club is pretty powerful. I mean, we move through our lives in various ways, getting marked, and different people sort of giving us opportunities to assess our self-worth, for lack of a better word. Now, many of those ideas are rooted in a construct. Let's be clear about that, but nevertheless, it still has power. But it also sounds like one of the criteria for membership is the loss of voice, right? The unwillingness to get in. You can't speak your conscience. So I guess I'm curious. So how did you get through the system and still have that in place? And when you look at these other folks who are whistleblowers, oftentimes working in coalition, what was it that, I don't want to be flippant about them, what allowed them to keep their soul as they navigated this complex and in some cases flattering ascension through these systems?
You're talking about the people who don't say anything.
No, the people who actually still, in spite of all these things, like you're going to get kicked out of the club if you speak out of turn,
right,
or you shine a bad light on it. And yet some people, and there were others in your book who actually still took on that Herculean task of being cast out. What has it allowed them to hold on to that, right?
I mean, I think it's different for everybody. And that was part of what I was interested in trying to figure out in the book. One of the things that I found really striking is just how haunted, sometimes tormented, these people are that I spoke to, often decades after it had happened. It's almost as if there was a kind of radical existential break in their lives, and everything is measured as either before they blew the whistle or after they blew the whistle. And it marks them. I mean, it really scars them. And it scars them even if they succeed. This was the surprising part to me. There's some people that I look at in the book who failed. And I think probably the whistleblower that troubled me the most is an oncologist named John Pasando, who spoke out about an experimental bone marrow transplant at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, funded by a big biotech company, that wound up basically killing. Depends on how you measure it. No one survived the trial. No one survived the trial, but in the Seattle Times piece, they put the death count at 21 subjects who would have had an up to 60% chance of full remission if they'd gotten a standard treatment for their leukemia or lymphoma. I mean, this is a guy, John Pasando, who was at the Hutch, spoke out while he was at the Hutch, lost his job, never worked in medical research again, kept after it, wrote countless letters to regulators, eventually got the attention of reporters at the Seattle Times, like 15, 20 years after the fact, got an award-winning Pulitzer finalist winning series in the Seattle Times, and a lawsuit on behalf of the patients, none of which succeeded, none of which made any difference at all. There was no apology, no compensation. The lawsuit failed. The regulators ruled against them. I mean, and one of the investigators on the study won the Nobel Prize in medicine. I mean, you can't come up with a more demoralizing ending than John Pasando's. And this is the way he sees it, as a complete failure. It doesn't surprise me that someone like that would be completely devastated by the experience. What surprised me were people who, from the outside, looked as if they had won. If you look at the people who exposed the abuses at the Willowbrook State School, it took a long time. I mean, I think it was not until 1989 that Willowbrook was shut down. But in the end, that was a win. And the hepatitis study stopped in 1972. But again, Mike Wilkins, tormented by this. I mean, he has never really been the same afterwards. It's the same for Ron Jones, the whistleblower in his 80s now, who exposed the so-called unfortunate experiment in New Zealand, which was a study started in the 1960s in which women with a precursor of cervical cancer were left untreated for decades and often developed cervical cancer and died. Again, there's a judicial inquiry. The women were compensated. There was an apology. The research oversight system was remade. The bad guys, the villains, were punished. It looks like a win, and yet, again, tormented by it, haunted by it. And I think in each case, there are different explanations. If you ask them why and talk about it, you'll find a different answer. But I think the big struggle that all of us have is telling a coherent story about this in the absence of any kind of external ratification for what has happened, right? If it really were, if whistleblower stories really were David and Goliath stories, which I think everybody kind of expects, that would be one thing, but they never are, because David loses, Goliath wins. And so then you have to figure out a way of telling yourself a story and getting some sort of meaning out of this, with only at best partial success and at worst, complete failure.
If you don't mind me asking, like, where would you situate yourself in terms of your journey of making meaning of your experience?
Well, I wrote the book. This was my way. I mean, everybody has their own particular psychology, and mine is if there is something troubling, difficult, problematic that I'm struggling with, my impulse is to step back and try to figure out how to understand it from the outside. And so this process of comparing my story with these other stories is my way of doing that. The thing that I didn't quite expect, but was probably even more ratifying, was developing these connections with the people that I talked to. And all of them, I mean, honestly, I mean, John Pasando, I remember him saying, like, who do you talk to about somebody like this? Because nobody really understands. You don't really understand unless you've been through it. And most of the whistleblowers I talked to had never met anybody else who had been through this before.
Mhm.
And then so if I'm able to talk to them about it, we both, you know, the novelist Walker Percy has this phrase, the community of the alienated, right? You develop a kind of solidarity with people who are in that same situation of alienation that you are.
Yeah, it reminds me of some folks in my father's generation. You know, we talked about experiencing war together, and that there's certain conversations that can only be had, you know, by those folks who and those sets of lived experiences. So I can appreciate that. Cycling back to where we were just a moment ago, I mean, we were talking about the prestige of the institutions, right, and being able to make offerings to society of care and goodness, and that those are significant drivers. But also, if we look at the pharmaceutical industry as a business, it also seems like there are also significant economic drivers that may cause somebody to silence themselves in a situation in which the consequences are borne disproportionately by somebody else. Does that figure into the calculus, you think, in terms of these institutional responses, or is this sort of imposed amnesia or avoidance a broader sort of maybe cultural commitment? I don't know.
Well, other than my own story, there, I'm trying to think, were there any? I was about to say there were no other pharmaceutical company interest in any of these studies, which is not quite the case, because there was a big biotech interest in the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center study. What you'll generally find as you look at sort of the way research scandals have changed over time is that in the early days, you know, the days of the Holy Trinity, you know, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the main motivator, the main driver that pushed researchers into neglecting or running roughshod over the rights and welfare of subjects is some combination, or the drive for scientific success and the drive for personal academic success, right? Promotion, tenure, Nobel Prizes, this sort of thing. Starting, I would say, roughly in the 1990s, which is when you started to see the enormous growth of the pharmaceutical industry and the sort of takeover of clinical trials by the pharmaceutical industry. That's when financial interests really started to come into play, because then you have a huge number of clinical trials sponsored by the pharmaceutical companies in which nobody is looking for Nobel Prizes or promotion, tenure, whatever. Those are not the things you get by partnering with a pharmaceutical company to do clinical trials. What you get is a lot of money. And so that's the sort of motivator in a lot of these studies today. That said, not all of them. I mean, there is still the drive for promotion, tenure, and the humanitarian mission. Like I don't want to give anybody the idea that I'm completely dismissing the value of medical research, because we all depend on it, right? But There's a lot of very bad medical research that's done, and there's a lot of good medical research in which where the rights and welfare of subjects are ignored.
I mean, it's a real tension to hold. Like, we do need research. We do need to continue to look into things. Sometimes I wonder whether the project of human improvement, again, is tied to some more problematic things. But I agree that if there are challenges that we can solve as a society or as an industry, that could happen. But, going back to this fact that many people are sort of deeply wounded, I wonder how much of that is about sort of the disillusionment of coming into the knowing and having maybe a sense of shame or regret or somehow self-flagellation for not knowing, not seeing what perhaps they thought they should have been able to see. Do you think that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's almost always the case. I mean, I can't tell you how many times someone said, I was so naive. This is what I thought. So the naive part of them, I mean, it takes a certain amount of idealism to be a whistleblower. Right? I mean, cynics don't blow the whistle because they're convinced that the system is rigged. And if they blow the whistle, it'll just all blow back on them. So they're not going to do it. The people who do blow the whistle have at least some hope that if other people know what they know, then they will be just as outraged as they are. And then it doesn't happen. I mean, it almost never happens. They think if I just go to the press and make this known, the authorities are going to leap into action and fix the problem. And that doesn't happen. They think all my friends and colleagues will stand by me. And that doesn't happen. They think, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. And then they come out of it thinking, wow, what a chump I was. Not all of them, but some of them do. Mike Wilkins, I'm a Southerner. I almost said bless his heart. But he is that sort of guy. He is the sweetest, nicest human being on the planet. And he will say, I mean, he is a guy who's deeply wounded, struggled with PTSD, depression, substance abuse his whole life. All the while trying to do the right thing, taking care of, poor, marginalized patients who couldn't pay. He will still say, I still believe it. I still believe the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. But a lot of people really have their doubts after going through this.
I can imagine. I can imagine. There was a really beautiful section later in the book where you navigating this sort of conversation around the importance of an apology, because it's oftentimes the things that the institutions withhold because I guess to some degree it assumes culpability. So could you speak a little bit more about apologies and how they, I think that the passage really talk about how it shifts the power dynamic and the burden away from those who've been transgressed against and resituates it where it more properly belongs on the people who were actively transgressing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what's interesting to me, talking to victims of research abuses. In the book, most of these people are long gone, so I didn't get to talk to many of them. But I have talked to others, and very often that is the only thing they want. They just want someone to say, "I'm sorry, you were mistreated." They're not looking for money. They just want some acknowledgement that they were wrong. And this is the one thing that research institutions just will not do. Absolutely refuse. The most amazing case of it. I mean, in these sort of days of memorials and which memorials and monuments should stay up and which should come down. It's remarkable how few memorials there are to the victims of research studies.
Mhm.
There is something for the victims of Tuskegee, but that's really about it. And I found one, I thought. The Cincinnati radiation studies. So another, horrific series of studies done. They're funded by the military, funded by the Pentagon. The idea was we want to find out what radiation would do to soldiers in the case of a nuclear attack. And so we're going to expose subjects in a hospital with cancer to massive doses of whole body irradiation and measure what happens to them. Without telling them what we're doing, without telling them that it's funded by the military, and without telling them they might die as a result. And the guy who did this was a radiologist named Eugene Sanger. Again, largely poor, 60% African-American population in Cincinnati. And the whistleblower there was this amazing English professor named Martha Stevens, an untenured junior English professor from Waycross, Georgia, not too far from where I grew up in South Carolina, who found out about it, what was going on in the medical school, investigated, got her junior faculty association involved in protesting, got them shut down, but it was kind of swept under the rug and kept quiet. And then again, when I don't know if any of you remember or know about the Bill Clinton era investigation into radiation studies all over the United States. The Cincinnati radiation studies came up again. She again got involved, tracked down the victims of the study, put them in touch with a lawyer, and they launched a lawsuit against her own institution. And there was a settlement. And as a result of the settlement, the hospital was forced to put up a memorial to the subjects on hospital grounds. The architect of the studies, Eugene Sanger, refused to apologize. He was like, this is not going to happen. This is my line in the sand. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not apologizing. But the settlement did include a memorial. So I thought, I need to see this memorial. And this would have been, I think, about in 2017. And I went to Cincinnati, I went to the hospital and asked, can I see the memorial? No idea what I'm talking about. Nobody knows about it. I'm like, it's the radiation studies, the famous radiation studies. No idea. They thought I had a radiology appointment. Kept trying to send me to the radiology department. It's like, no, I'm here to see the memorial. Eventually they find somebody who knows where it is. And she leads me like down into the sub-basement, along these long corridors, eventually emerging up a stairwell into the sunlight, into what appears to be a courtyard of some sort, next to the parking ramp and a bunch of like heating equipment or something. And, I'm just thinking, my first thought was, this looks like the smoking area, right? This looks like, where people go out to, to smoke a cigarette with nobody looking. But there's no memorial. And I say, like, where is it? And she points me to this giant bush, which is about 7 feet tall, and says, it's behind that bush. And this thing is enormous. And, I still can't see it. And he said, well, it's hard to see. The bush is right next to the wall of the hospital. She said, you need to slide in behind the bush next to the hospital and face out toward the bush, and then you can see it. And I did, and it's about the size of my book, a little tiny thing, maybe about twice the size. And it has the names of it says victims, Cincinnati radiation. No, it doesn't say victims. It says subjects of Cincinnati radiation study. Doesn't say what was done to them, what it's about. No one would have any idea what this was. And, you know, it's also facing the wall of the hospital. So you have to stand with your back there to see it. And I thought, I thought, yeah, this is how it works. Even when you force an institution to apologize and put up a memorial like this, they will do everything possible to make sure that the victims get no satisfaction out of it whatsoever. Because you're right, it does require lowering themselves. Victims can, you know, if they're apologized to, they can say, I don't accept it, or that's not good enough. And that is a kind of loss of faith, a loss of honor that seems to be way worse than paying out millions in a settlement.
Yeah, that's strange. Let me just do a quick time check. How are we doing on time? Because I know we want to get.
Shayna, and have Shayna ask some virtual questions that have come in, and we're gonna ignore you all in the room. Apologies, we can grab Carl after the program. I'm sorry, Carl.
So we,
No, it's fine.
so the pivot is now?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So thank you for this incredibly thoughtful discussion. It has resulted in a lot of questions and comments in our virtual webinar. So I'd like to ask the first one. It says, hi, Carl, do you think there are any interventions that those of us who teach medical students, researchers, etc., can use to better prepare our students to recognize ethical problems and stand up to do the right thing?
You know, I have mixed feelings about trying to answer that question. I suppose it depends on what you mean by teach, because the kind of teaching that I've been doing in medical schools for like 30 years now, I think does no good whatsoever. I mean, I would like to think the things that I concentrate on in my lectures do more good than some of the others, but in the end, I actually don't think that this is an issue of knowledge. I think it's an issue of the culture of medicine on the wards. It's not a philosophical problem, it's a sociological problem. And it's the sociology of how to deal with patients and how to deal with research subjects in a way that is respectful and that allows for dissent when they're being mistreated. That's really the issue. That said, I think back on what I know now. I mean, I have to say, for obvious reasons, I don't do a lot of teaching to medical students now at my own institution. I've been moved to the philosophy department. So, you know, but if I were still teaching in the medical school, what I would do is teach students about the history of abuses, not just about the rules and, you know, this sort of standard line of how, you know, research subjects were abused in the past before we have all the, you know, the sort of fixes that we have in place now. I would try to teach them about the holes in the system, about how easy it is to allow abuses to happen simply because you're afraid of doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing or breaking ranks in some way, because you want to fit in, right? Really, that's a large part of what it's about. You want to fit in. You want to be a part of the club.
Thank you for that. And we have one more question, and you might find that you're repeating yourself a little bit, but it says, Carl, can you talk a bit about how you see the institutions that are supposed to protect participants in medical research? In particular, one, bioethics, as a professional and academic field, and 2 institutional review boards.
Yeah, no, I have a lot to say about that. Just cut me off at a certain point. So there are 2 things. I mean, bioethicists are the people who are trained in bioethics, who teach it, work as clinical ethicists in institutions and other sort of policymaking positions. Institutional review boards are the oversight bodies that are not composed of bioethicists by and large, but are there to protect the rights and welfare of research subjects. In my lifetime, there has been a big shift in bioethics. The location of bioethics in particular, but the sort of institutional role of bioethics. If you look back sort of to the birth of bioethics in the 1960s and 1970s, you'll find that a lot of those powerful voices came from outside medicine. A lot of them in divinity schools, people like Paul Ramsey, Richard McCormick, Joseph Fletcher, Jim Gustafson. What you started to see in the 1990s, and you know, institutionally, these were people who were often located not in medical schools, but in divinity schools or philosophy departments or freestanding institutions like the Hastings Center or the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown. Starting in the 1990s, what you started to see, largely, I think, because of the influx of money from the Human Genome Project into academic health centers, with a certain percentage of that set aside for ethics, you started to see the establishment of bioethics centers in particularly elite academic medical institutions, Stanford, Harvard, Hopkins. You can sort of go through the whole list. Since that time, the sort of locus of power in bioethics has moved inside academic medical centers. The problem is that I think bioethicists have essentially been co-opted by academic medicine. All their colleagues are are physicians and people who work in academic medical institutions. Their tenure decisions, their promotion decisions, the deans, they are insiders now, right? But the problem with that is that you started thinking like insiders, and insiders in academic medicine do not dissent, particularly if they have such little power. And bioethicists in academic medical centers have no power, intentionally, right? You will almost never find a bioethicist who is ascended to be the dean of medicine, right? It's always a very kind of low status position. And as a result, bioethicists are now like a, sort of the PR arm of academic medical research.
May I attention? The entire auditorium will be closing at 5 p.m. this afternoon. That's including the research comments, vector area, and MSU. Thank you.
The library, but you also.
That's kind of ominous. Sounds like a big brother. Yeah. Yeah, suddenly like somebody's got the mute button on. I didn't even know they were listening in.
The panoptic is real.
Yeah. Institutional review boards, I mean, do I even want to go there? Our oversight system is a very patchwork system. It's a kind of peer review system. It's an honor system. It is not a full-blown regulatory system. And academic physicians have fought against regulation since the early days, since the sort of post-Tuskegee reforms. And as a result, we have this sort of honor code, which is supposed to govern research, but research is now this sort of global, multinational, multi-billion-dollar business, which we still depend on an honor code to, to oversee. And I think it's sort of clearly inadequate to the task.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, so that puts us at time. Thank you for all of your questions, everyone. Big thanks to our access team and also Emily Badix for coordinating this entire event. And of course, thank you so much to Milton Reynolds and Dr. Carl Elliott for this, again, really thoughtful discussion. I am putting a link in the chat where you can purchase the book. And to close us out, I'd like to do our book giveaway. So give me one moment as I pull that up. All right.
Oh, wow.
So I've put up a slide with the names of our 10 winners. And if the slide is not accessible to you, I'll be emailing out the list right after this event. Okay,
Very
and
impressive.
some of the
That's
names
great.
are
Very good. Well done.
Yeah.
okay. And once again, thank you so much, everyone. The link to this recording will be live on YouTube in a couple of weeks. Right, that's all for us virtual folks.